What we're talking about in this segment today is the experience of grief and loss, and also its relationship with loneliness. And first of all, we just want to remind ourselves of what is grief, but also who grieves. And I would imagine that anybody that's seeing this particular video has had a loss, maybe losses or significant people in their lives who have died. And so just even me saying we're going to be talking about grief and loss may trigger some emotion inside of you that you might be a little aware of as we're going through this particular talk. So grief is that process whereby we experience the psychological, behavioral, social, physical reactions to the experience of loss. And it's really important that we include the body in this, because our body is often the archive of that pain. And then people will say to me after a significant loss, they'll say, I just feel like I have the flu all the time, or I feel like I have indigestion all the time. And it's because their body is also giving them a message. Grief is not an intellectual only experience. It again is a full body experience. And it's a continuing development. And grief is really a process. It's movement. That we go from the devastating experience of an event to, over time, responding to that loss in a variety of ways. And grief is also a natural reaction. It's probably, for most of us, a very devastating but very natural experience. And it's a reaction to all types of loss, not just to the death of a loved one, but it can include death of a pet, it can include death of an idea, body parts that might have to be surgically removed because of cancer or whatever. So there's lots of different types of loss. Grief is dependent upon the individual's unique perception of loss. And as I was thinking about this talk, I was aware of all of the grievers that I have worked with over the years. And at Institute on Aging, we also have a traumatic loss grief service program, which includes a Saturday morning drop-in group, 8-week structured traumatic loss groups, a variety of ways in which people can experience and talk about what has happened to them. And there are two types of what we call ambiguous losses. And ambiguous losses are very, very challenging for people because, for example, people who are dealing with an ambiguous loss are perceived by family members as physically absent but psychologically present. So it's unclear whether they are dead or alive. And this has manifested in people who have come to our groups, our traumatic loss grief groups, wherein their loved one has perhaps jumped from the Golden Gate Bridge, and maybe somebody had seen them jump from the Golden Gate Bridge, but their body wasn't recovered just because of the current and the energy of that current. And so the body was probably taken out to sea. But it's very difficult for the survivors of that type of death because there's no body, But psychologically, they feel that the person is still present. And so it's a very difficult death to work through. Another form of ambiguous loss is that people are perceived as physically present, but psychologically absent. This condition is illustrated by people that have cognitive impairment or dementia, particularly Alzheimer's type, where their body is there, but psychologically they're not there because of the dementia. In each situation, those who suffer have to deal with something very different from ordinary clear-cut loss. But what we want to really affirm is that regardless of the way in which someone leaves us or the types of loss that you perceive, death is still death. No matter what the form of that death took, it's still death. And in a death-denying, ageist culture, it's very hard for us to really experience grief over time. Because what we hear oftentimes, and the grievers have certainly said this to me hundreds of times over the last years, is that people will say to them, aren't you over that yet? You know, it's really time, I think, that you stop dwelling on that. Why would you want to go to a grief group? Why would you want to do that and dredge all that up as if, you know, the facilitator is pulling the grief out of them? But it's in there. And it's very difficult, I think, in our society to really grieve. Other cultures are much more willing to spend time in the grief process, where they don't hear those kinds of phrases, which, aren't you over that yet? After all, it's been 6 months or whatever. And so we want to be very thoughtful about that. Complicated grief is a type of grief that results in a lot of intense trauma. And it's estimated that about 7% of bereaved people are dealing with complicated grief, difficult loss. People ruminate about the circumstances of the death, meaning that this type of loss doesn't easily move from one experience of it to another experience of it because of the way in which someone died. So if they jumped off the Golden Gate Bridge, or they were shot by in a drive-by shooting, or they were in a tragic automobile accident, these types of losses have a lot of images that are very difficult for people to manage. People use excessive avoidance in order to steer clear of reminders. So they might say, I don't want to go to, these Golden Gate Park or whatever it might be, because that's where my loved one and I spent time and had experiences. So I'm just not able to go there. I don't want to go to restaurants where we had been as a family or as friends. So there's a lot of avoidant behavior that people experience. Also, there is just intense emotion in complicated grief. What is most particular to complicated grief are feelings of guilt. Guilt, even if you weren't even in the same state when your loved one died. People will blame themselves and say, if only I would have called my loved one more frequently, or if only I would have, emailed them more often. And that guilt is a way of trying to figure out how this horrible, devastating event could have occurred. And so I'll find a shortcut and blame myself because it's too hard, it's too difficult to even wrap my mind around that my loved one had died in a very, painful way. So we want to be aware of that. And prolonged or complicated grief is now part of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. And so there is a recognition now that complicated grief, traumatic loss, can be something that is diagnosable and requires maybe a little bit more effort. That might include professional helpers, counselors, that sort of thing, to get us through that. And just one thing that I was thinking about that is a way for us to really kind of comprehend the difficulty that people experience with trauma. And this is just a short quote by James Patterson. And he writes, "The weird thing about devastating loss is that life actually goes on. When you're faced with a tragedy, a loss so huge that you have no idea how you can live through it, somehow, the world just keeps turning. The seconds keep ticking." And how do we understand that? And that's often what grievers will say to me, is that if only I could go to some island somewhere and be tended to and be comforted until I work my way through this experience. But no, I have to go back to work, or I have to pay the bills, or I have to take care of whatever it is in my life I have to take care of. But I'm not fully functional. And that's really difficult for people. And what we tend to do, whether the grief is traumatic or the grief is something that has been anticipated, death is still a formidable experience for us who are still living, because we know that if my loved one could die, that means I could die as well. And so underneath my pain for the loss of my loved one is also this experience of my own mortality. And that can be another complicated factor in terms of my grief experience. So we want to be aware that when people are dealing with these devastating losses, that we may start to build walls around ourselves, even though we're not knowing it. We might start to shift away from being involved with people because we just feel so bad, so devastated. And then, because we're feeling very sensitive, we fear being judged by others. And that's where these comments come. Why isn't he or she over it? They should be. And so families talk about, I hear this all the time, well, they should be over it by now. And again, we put these very short time frames on what being over it means. It might be just as short as 6 months. Withdrawing heightens the sense of isolation. So if the person who's grieving, whatever the loss is, doesn't feel that there's a space for them, doesn't feel that they can talk about their loss in an open and feel cared about, they're going to withdraw. They're going to isolate. And that's not going to be very helpful, because what might occur as well as the bereavement is also now feelings of depression. And we know that depression is part of the grieving experience, and we need to see that as, they play a role together. But depression is very different than the experience of grief, and we'll talk about that more. Depression and isolation kind of correlate. And if I feel isolated, I might start to feel like I don't belong. And if I don't belong, I might also start to feel like I'm just a burden to my family. And that experience of, that I don't feel connected can start to evolve into a depression. And that depression, unlike grief moves. It's like a flow. Depression is about stopping, and I don't any longer even attempt to connect with people, and that's a problem. In the midst of isolation and depression, we may start to wonder, why is this happening to me? I'm thinking about an adult child, a daughter who's in her 40s, and her mother died of a brain cancer at the age of 79, and she was with her mother when she died, which she was grateful for, but it was really a devastating experience for her. And she just had one of these relationships with her mother that was so, intense and so beautiful, and they did a lot of things together, a lot of traveling, and they spoke to each other, even though the mother lived in another part of the country, but they spoke all the time, several times a week, even more, and just did a lot of things together. And when the mother died, the daughter is just so unbelievably devastated. She cannot accept that her mother died. And she said, and the problem that she encounters is that when somebody says, well, how old was your mother? And she says 79, what she hears is not comfort, not we care about you. It's, oh, she was 79. Aren't you lucky to have all that time you had with her? How great that was. And she said, and I want to just smack them, is what she told me, that is not helpful, It doesn't make me feel better that you think it was great that I had all that time with my mother. I wanted more time. I can't believe my mother died. And then she said, I go internal. I don't say anything. And yet I'm walking around devastated. But I don't say anything anymore. And so you can see where people start feeling very, very lonely at a time when we're grieving that we really need others. We really need to be in the safety of other people's embrace. When loneliness is intermingled with grief, the grief can be very intense, and we might get stuck in it, that we might stop the process by staying in protest too long, by hiding out in avoidance, by using drugs or alcohol is a way to dull those emotions by saying to people, oh, I'm fine, I'm okay, when we are the opposite of okay, and so we're not telling the emotional truth. Grief really demands truthfulness, demands sharing this experience. We can cry. Tears are a legitimate sign of loss, but what people do oftentimes when somebody is crying, they jump in there to, hold them, but the message that is received is, I'm going to help you stop crying, rather than, no, cry. If you need to cry, cry. I'll be here to just make sure you're safe. Caregiving for a dying loved one is frequently associated with significant physical and psychological vulnerability on the part of the adult child or the spouse or whoever that might be who's caring for that person. Dying isn't easy, in our culture. And the person who is in, an acute care setting, who has all kinds of tubes that they're connected to, it's very hard to feel the warmth and care of people around you when you're separated from them by medical technology. It's very difficult. Alarmingly, 14% of caregivers admitted entertaining suicidal ideation in one study. And there's lots of information out there about the anxiety that prolonged hospital stays induce in people who care about their loved one. One of the most painful aspects of the grieving process then can be loneliness. No one understands me. I hear this all the time. Nobody really wants to hang out with me. They want to tell me what to do. One woman in her 80s whose husband died of a massive heart attack, she said that what she feels, she's always lived either with her family of origin or she lived in a dormitory with girlfriends and then lived with her husband for the next 50 years. She said, I'm not used to living alone and I feel a little scared. And she said, I really want somebody to be there when I take a shower. I want somebody to be there in the evening with me. But she said, somebody will say, oh, I want to be there with you. And they come. And then she said, for the next 3 hours, they're talking at me. They're telling me what to do, or they're trying to change my focus from thinking about my husband's death to talking about other things. And she said, why can't they just shut up? Why can't they just shut up? I just want them to sit there, watch a DVD with me, sit there, and let me take a shower. But they want to talk to me. She said, my daughter even comes into the bathroom with me and she's talking at me while I'm taking a shower. And she said, and we're not talking about her dad's death. She's talking about all kinds of other things to change my mind, to move me away from thinking about it. And she said, I want to think about him. He's my friend, my spouse, the father of my children. I want to think about him. And so, again, in a grief-denying culture, we rob people from the opportunity to really experience, the full effect of the loss of whoever that was on their life. And we've got to think about that. Loneliness, again, can increase people's pain. And so we don't want people who are grieving to be crying alone at night by themselves. We want to bring them out of that kind of darkness and say it's okay to talk about that. It's okay to share your feelings. It's okay to writhe on the floor if that's what you want to do, because grief affects your whole body. It can be unsettling and scary, to find yourself alone maybe for the first time in your life, or to have experienced the death of an adult child and have to bury one of your children. That's a very difficult experience that none of us are able to plan for. That is a very troubling experience. There's also that physical aloneness. If your spouse, if your partner dies, what dies with that individual is the affection that you had or shared with each other. It's the intimacy, whether that's sexual intimacy or just gentle affection in terms of hugging or holding, that goes too. I was with a group of older women one day talking to them about the experience of grief and loss, and they happen to have all lost their husbands or partners, male. And I said to them about that, I said, well, why don't we talk about the loss of affection, the loss of sexual intimacy? And each one of them said almost simultaneously, no one has even thought of asking us about that question. And so we don't open that up because we think people are going to be embarrassed by it. And so we had this really wonderful discussion for 2 hours about the loss of intimacy, physical intimacy and psychological intimacy with that partner. And they were so grateful. And it was really great that they heard from each other about that kind of experience. And it was just a wonderful thing. And it pains me to think that out there, it's so hard to bring that up as an area of loss. It's not just the person who died, it's all these secondary losses that accompany that. And they need to be acknowledged as well. Insidious loneliness, you know, this kind of fierce kind of loneliness is the kind of loneliness that makes you feel like you're alone in the world, you know. And that goes back to, how could this have happened to me? One older woman whose 25-year-old daughter died by suicide death, she just cannot see it. She can't accept it. She can't talk about it. And she just says, my life is ruined. I'm never going to be able to feel any kind of engagement with people, even though I have another daughter. I can hardly be with her because when I'm with her, I just think of my other daughter. She should be here too. And so she said, I know I'm ignoring the one daughter who's living, but I can't help it. I just can't stop thinking about the daughter who died. That's really painful, you know. And she doesn't feel that she can really ever connect again because she can't believe that she let her daughter die, even though she didn't do anything. But she cannot kind of move with the flow of grief. And it's insidious, the type of loneliness that she's experiencing. There is the alone feeling that comes when nobody seems to understand. And I see that so often in many of our grievers, that they just don't feel like people get it. They don't get it. It's not something that is going to resolve quickly. Grief takes time, and it's also effort. You know, anybody who is listening to this who has lost someone significant knows that there is a process. It takes time to grieve. You know, for those who grieve, this might occur when they feel others aren't tolerant or accepting of their grief, and so they feel isolated. And again, that's one of the most painful experiences for people who are grieving to go through. It's hard enough to have lost my loved one, but now I feel like I'm just isolated because I'm a burden to people. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to talk about it. And we know in a death-denying culture, this isn't an arena that people are going to actively say, hey, I'll sit with you, you know, you can talk to me and it's okay. They may also cut themselves off emotionally if it seems like people are uncomfortable with their expression of grief-related emotions, or if others react to their feelings in a way that minimizes their grief or pushes them to move forward too fast. So whether we are a family member, a friend, or a practitioner, what we have to be aware of is pacing, you know, that we might feel we want to hurry them on their way so they're not in so much suffering, but that's not going to be very helpful in the long run because you don't want to push people beyond the pace at which they can go. And so it's like following the dragon's tail. You know, you don't want to confront the dragon. What you want to do is follow it to see where it wants to go. And so we allow ourselves as facilitators or practitioners to be able to say, how do you feel today? Tell me about that. And we don't have to jump ahead to, 6 months from now. How do you feel right now? How are you managing this loss? And then let the individual express whatever it is that they're feeling in the moment. The other area that we want to acknowledge is death of pets. That if those of you are listening to this have a pet, and I asked you how many of you would believe that your pet is like family, I think you'd probably all raise your hands, because pets are very significant. One older woman said to me, again, she had been married a couple times, and she said, you know, the loss of her husband, that was hard, but she said what was really hard was the loss of my dog. And she said, my dog accepted me in a way that my husband's never did. And so when my dog died, she said, I have been just so devastated. And yet, in terms of how we look at grief out there in the world, is that we have a lot of divisions, and people will say, you only lost your dog. It's a death of a cat. That's not the same. And yet to that individual, it is the same. It's estimated that about 78 million dogs and 85.8 million cats are owned in the United States. And approximately 44% of all households in the US have a dog, and 35% of households have a cat. The number who experience pet loss is high. And particularly when it comes to an older person that has a cat or a dog, and they're in their 80s and that cat or dog died, people want to immediately say, oh, we'll just get another cat, not taking into consideration that older person might be thinking, well, I'm 80 years old. I don't want the cat to outlive me, because who would take care of it? And so trying to replace these animals too quickly interferes with the individual's grief process. So death of a pet is really significant, particularly for older persons. And the problem is that these pets often have a shorter lifespan, and so people might grieve a number of losses of pets over time. But for older people, as I said, they might say, no, I don't want to have another pet for the reasons I stated earlier. So because many people are unable or unwilling to acknowledge a pet as a legitimate attachment for people, they don't accept the loss of someone's pet as significant. And that does a disservice to that older person or younger person, is that we need to just acknowledge that for them, the loss of that pet is really significant, so that they have space to talk about that. So thus the case of a loss of a pet is another example of what we refer to as disenfranchised grief, that the person is embarrassed or afraid to talk about the loss of a pet because they are afraid that somebody's going to criticize them or devalue their experience. Other kinds of disenfranchisement has to do with the couple that might be married and the marriage has not been working for a long time, and one or the other of the spouse has another partner who is not legitimate in terms of the family, and then when that person dies, oftentimes the person that is, and maybe in a long-term relationship with that person, but wasn't the married partner, is not included in the funeral service or that sort of thing. We've seen that a lot with gay and lesbian or transgendered people, where there has been a death of a partner maybe of 30 years, and they are disenfranchised. They're not included in the funeral services because people that might live in another state, other relatives swoop in and take charge because they are considered blood relatives where the partner is not. And so we're still struggling with that. So where there is disenfranchisement, there is isolation and loneliness. So what mediates the grief process? What affects the process of grief? And certainly the type of loss. So when somebody loses a loved one to death by suicide, that can be a devastating, very difficult experience to mourn. And as I said earlier, one of the feelings that is very uppermost in terms of people who are dealing with that type of traumatic loss is guilt, and guilt just doesn't easily go away. There's no pill for it. You have to work through it. You have to talk about it. Another mediating factor is the relationship between the person's loss and what was lost. If the person who meant the most to me in the world dies, it's not going to be easy to replace that person. The adult daughter that I was referring to earlier, whose mother died of brain cancer and died rather quickly, they had a very special relationship that was extraordinarily meaningful for both of them. And what the adult daughter is grieving is that I may never have a relationship like that ever again, that is gone. People who say, you know, the person who died was my soulmate. You know, we were destined to be together. And when that person dies, not only did I lose that person, but I may never have that type of relationship again. How many relationships do we have that we say was the most important relationship in my life? Not everybody has that. And when it's gone, that has to be grieved as well. So we have to pay attention to secondary losses. How the person learned about the loss. You know, if you were called on the telephone and told that your loved one in another culture, visiting another country, died in an automobile crash, and you hear it from somebody in another place, that's just overwhelming. You know, people just fall apart over that kind of thing. Sometimes people have learned about it through a text, about the loss of a loved one on a text. That's so impersonal and problematic for the individual, because not only are they dealing with the loss of the person who died, but they also have to deal with the insensitivity of a text, you know, that they didn't even call. How did we learn about the loss? If you were there and the person died, many years ago we had a young mother who had 2 little children, and her husband came home and opened the door, you know, to their living room, and the mother was there with these 2 little kids, and he walked in, pulled out a gun, and shot himself in the head in front of her and died. That's not going to be easy to manage that kind of experience. Very difficult and very complicated. It's not just the death of my husband, it's that I have this image, you know, and that's part of trauma, which are these insidious images that are very invasive. And they'll say, I just can't get that out of my mind. And what we have to do is talk about it, you know. Repetitive accounts of the loss are very helpful, you know. And it can be very challenging for the family member or the practitioner who is listening to this, because it's really hard to hear these kind of stories of grave suffering that is part of this grief experience. And we have to be able to provide space for them. Was the loss sudden or anticipated? Sudden death, just the word sudden, we know we weren't prepared for it, you know? We didn't have anything to anticipate oftentimes. And if we do anticipate it, such as my mother has dementia, and she's had it for 15 years, and I anticipate that she's going to die, at least you can do some work. You can talk about how I might feel when mother dies. But even when mother dies of dementia, what you thought it was going to be and how it really is are often 2 different things. And so we have to grieve that as well. And then, did the loss occur at a normal developmental time, or did it occur out of time? And meaning that if this was an adult child, or if this was a grade school child, it's very hard, you know, to grieve these losses. I've had the experience many times of where the death was out of time. So what we want to do with people, whether the death was sudden and traumatic or the death was anticipated, death is still death and can be very devastating. We want to avoid statements such as, he would want you to be brave. He would want you to go on. Not such a great statement. Or it was her time, even if the person was young. You know, people use these platitudes because they think they're helping, and that doesn't work. It's been a year. You should be over this by now, as I said earlier. She or he is in a better place. Well, one woman said to me, how in the hell do you know that? You know, do you have a crystal ball? Don't tell me that. You know, you can see where the griever gets very agitated. On top of everything else, they have to defend themselves against your platitudes that you think are helpful. And what that says is many times people in our culture don't know how to respond. They don't know how to say, hey, I care about you. You know, and if you want to talk to me about your loss, I am here, you know, and I'll just sit with you. You know, time will heal. Oh, that's the one. Time will heal this. Well, time chronicles minutes, hours, weeks, months, but effort and time work together. You know, that we have to talk about this, and we have all our lives. I say to our grievers all the time, you have all of your life to work through this, because you're not going to forget your dad. You're not going to forget your adult son. You're not going to forget, you know, use this time. You know, it's okay. And I also believe that grief has a developmental component, that if your death happened 10 years ago, you might have felt one way about it, but 20 years later, you might have a whole different set of feelings about it, particularly if it was a parent who died, let's say at 72, and now you're approaching the same age as your parent when they died. You might have a very different kind of experience of that death. It's time for you to move on, where there's this very patronizing comment that I, your pal, say it's time to move on, as if I know that for certain. You know, I know a woman who lost her husband, and with 3 years, she was happily remarried, you know. Oh, you'll meet somebody else. It's like, no, that's not the thing to say to somebody a week, a month, a year after their death. Don't you think it's time you got over this? Oh, you must be devastated. I lost my son, or if I lost my son, I would kill myself. That's not helpful, you know, to say those things to people. We have to avoid those kinds of statements. So what does help? Well, listening, you know, active listening, compassionate listening. Listen with your whole body, you know, to the underlying emotion, to just the underlying suffering that people experience when they have a devastating loss. Listen for the emotional signals. You know, so when somebody starts to cry, don't leap up to hug them. You know, let them have that space. You know, let them feel that feeling, and just remind them that you're sitting there. It's okay. You know, I'm paying attention. You know, if you come by and the person just wants a hug and can't speak, don't push the person to speak. Just sit with the person, as I said. Don't encourage conversation when the person barely could get out of bed in the morning. Give them time and give them space. Don't grill the grieving person with questions to fill the awkward or aching silence. Just be still. Just be there. And that is so much, you know, that is so great to be able to do that. And let them know that you are available and that you're going to call them again tomorrow. What a lot of people do with somebody who's grieving, they will call the person and say, oh, you call me if you need me. Let me know if you need me. Well, the griever is going to say again, I can barely get up in the morning. I can barely feed myself. I don't think I'm going to call you because you might be busy and I'm going to feel rejected on top of everything else. But if you want to help somebody, say to them, hey, I'm going to call you every day and check in on you. You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to, because this might be hard, but I'm going to call you to let you know I care. I'm going to stay connected with you. You know, what often happens, and we know this, that, you know, in the beginning, when there's a loss, that there's a lot of activity around it. There's going to be the funeral. There's going to be a memorial service. There might be the unveiling a year later if you're Jewish. You know, there's all kinds of, you know, rituals that happen in the beginning. And then you get beautiful sympathy cards, for a while. One gentleman said to me his daughter had died at the age of 13 in a terrible automobile accident. And he said when her cohort group graduated from high school, he said, I just hope that somebody would have sent me a card. He was a single father, would have sent me a card to say, we're thinking about your daughter who would have graduated today. And he said, no cards came. And he said, and I'm not angry at them. He said, I think that they believe that I'm over it, but I'll never be over it. That's my daughter. And she would have graduated, and I was very aware of that. But again, in our grief-denying culture, we either think, well, if I bring it up, the person is going to be upset. And I say to those people, bring it up and let them be upset. Let them know it's okay to be upset with me. People need people to remember that my loved one was on the planet. Don't forget about them. And we have to kind of reconfigure how we think about grief and loss. Be empathetic. You need to use your empathic skills with people to share that suffering. And I know it's not easy to do that. When you have people in your life who have had really difficult losses, it's really hard to sit with them because we want them to feel better. I think that's very natural. But in grief, you have to let them feel whatever they're feeling. Don't push them into feeling better because they're going to start acting like that, but it's not real. We need to have them be the way they actually are. Help the survivor experience the event, as I said, at their own pace. But it's really important for us to acknowledge that death occurred. Try not to use euphemisms. Oh, they passed away. Well, they didn't quite pass away. They died, or well, they expired. Well, it's like a balloon or something that lost air. No, the person died, And I know for grievers that's hard to hear, but it's the truth, We have to acknowledge the truth. And then let the person feel whatever it is they are feeling. We've got to acknowledge that this terrible event did occur, and that we, your friends or family, are here with you. So what helps? Remembering, And maybe in the beginning of the loss, people can't look at photographs. They can't take dad or mom's or my child's clothes out of the closets. They can't do that. And oftentimes family members want to jump in there and say, well, let's get rid of mother's stuff, But the dad may want to open that closet and smell those clothes that reminds him of his wife of 48 years. He's not ready. Well, he'll be ready one day, but he's not ready today. We want to create a climate of remembrance. It's okay to talk about our loved ones. It's okay to share photographs of our loved ones and to remember that this person died, Nostalgia, that sentimental longing for one's past, is based on the contemporary usage by lay people across many cultures. Is this, let me talk about my son and his bar mitzvah, or the graduation from high school or college, or my wedding with my spouse of 30 years or partner. Some researchers believe that our nostalgic memories provide a sense of belonging. See, again, this theme of belonging and support, that I did have this relationship. I did have this marriage. This is still part of my history, and I don't want to never talk about it. I want somebody who wants to be interested in that. I had a relationship with this person or persons. The comfort of our past gives us our strength so that we can move into the future. My loved one is always part of my history, but if you won't let me talk about it, that's a problem. So many times on holidays, grievers will say to me, I want to integrate my loved one into this family event, but I'm afraid that the host, let's say my daughter-in-law, doesn't want that to occur because she doesn't want the family to be unhappy. You know? See, and I say, I think you really need to explore this in more depth, because if last year at Thanksgiving dinner, the loved one was right there at the table, and now this year they're absent, not because they're in Tahiti, but because they died, I think we need to talk about that with the host or hostess of this event, and it may not be appropriate for you to go this year. If there's no acknowledgement of the person that's not there anymore, and you're going to be thinking about the whole time, you know, you might want to find another thing to do that day. But it's okay to say, I want somehow to honor my loved one. It doesn't have to be a big, awful experience. It could just be lighting a candle. There's so many things that we can do, and we want to think about that. Nostalgia assuages this loneliness if I can talk about my loved one, and if people want to listen to me. As I said earlier, grief demands the attention of other humans, you know, who really are in the position of witnessing that this devastating event actually did occur. And we're together, you know, we're together. And so now considered a social emotion like empathy, nostalgia can draw us closer to others. The idea being that when we feel an intense bond with loved ones from our past, learning to live with this loss, we're more likely to feel similar bonds with those around us. We can connect with others, you know, around this. One of the things we do in our traumatic loss grief groups is that we have one of our sessions is about memorabilia. That's not uncommon for a lot of grief groups. And you can see the bonding that happens between people when people bring pictures of their loved ones that we've been talking about for 6 weeks. And now people bring, you know, photographs, and always the people who have died are just these beautiful people. And everybody feels like, oh, you're just like me, I'm just like you, even though our deaths might be different, but we know the experience of grief, you know, and then we're more likely to feel connected. And I love this quote by Joan Didion in her book, The Year of Magical Thinking, where her husband had dropped dead one night after returning from seeing their daughter, who was hospitalized, and she did die subsequently. But she wrote the book about her husband. And I know this is a little lengthy, but I can't say it better than she says it. And so I'm going to read this to us. Grief turns out to be a place none of us know until we reach it. We know that someone close to us could die, but we do not look beyond the few days or weeks that immediately follow such an imagined death. We misconstrue the nature of even those few days or weeks. We might expect, if the death is sudden, to feel shock. We don't expect this shock to be obliterative, dislocating to both body and to mind. We might expect that we will be prostrate, inconsolable, crazy with loss. We don't expect to be literally crazy cool customers who believe that their husband is about to return because he needs his shoes. In the version of grief we imagine, the motto will be healing. The worst days will be the earliest days. We imagine that the moment to most severely test us will be the funeral, after which this hypothetical healing will take place. Nor can we know ahead of time the fact, and here lies the heart of the difference between grief as we imagine it and grief as it is, the unending absence that follows. You know, that follows this void, the very opposite of meaning, the relentless succession of moments during which we will confront the experience of meaninglessness itself. What we anticipate will happen and what does happen are often miles apart. And so we have to be able to connect with people who are feeling that my life has no meaning. It may never have meaning. And I don't know what to do. And what we have to say to them is, I understand that. You don't have to do anything except grieve. That's your work. That's what you have to do. And the final thing I want to say about this, and It's for all of us who care for people who have lost loved ones, who have sat with them in hospitals for hours and hours as the loved one is on this, medical equipment that may or may not be helpful, that have to pull the plug at some point, that stay with people long after the funeral is over. And this is a lovely poem by Emily Dickinson, who knows a few things about grief and loss herself. She said, "If I can stop one heart from breaking, I shall not live in vain. If I can ease one life the aching, or cool one pain, or help one fainting robin unto his nest again, I shall not live in vain." And I think that that's what really the opportunity is when we are with people who are grieving, is that we know that what we're doing is not useless, not valuable. It's really being able to connect with people, oftentimes at a point in their life which they would describe as the worst moment of my life. And to be able to sit there with somebody, what we're saying is that what I'm doing is not taken in vain. It's a remarkable thing to be able to do. Thank you very much.